This is Caught in the Act with Tim Clark.
Welcome back. The National Enquirer magazine has always, and probably will always be, the tabloidiest tabloid that ever tabloided. Founded in 1926, the splashy, trashy American publication has, in its history, actually published some amazing journalism. The paper was praised for playing a pivotal role in the capture of the killer of Bill Cosby's son, Ennis. Their coverage of the O.J. Simpson murder trial made it the Bible of the case. And their expose of former presidential candidate John Edwards and his extramarital affair almost won them a Pulitzer Prize. But those diamonds glistened amongst some of the roughest and raunchiest copy to ever grace a supermarket aisle. A lot of it completely made up. Fake news became not something to hide from for the National Enquirer, but something to sell on. And one of their biggest sellers has always, and probably always will be, Donald Trump. The mag and the Don seem made for each other. In fact, in a way, they did make each other. A symbiotic pairing of power and wealth, celebrity and gossip. For instance, in 1993, Trump invited Enquirer writer Linda Stasi into the room where his then wife Marla Maples had just given birth. When the new mum shooed a photographer away, Trump followed them, holding a blanket, and told them to take the pic and pretend there was a baby in his arms. That picture was never published. 2 decades on, the tabloid was still, allegedly, not running some stories about Donald Trump. But this time, they had paid big bucks for them, in order not to run them, a practice known as catch and kill. This month, Donald J. Trump became the first president, present or former, to face a criminal trial in the United States. And the allegation is that he and his minions, along with the National Enquirer, orchestrated a criminal scheme to corrupt the 2016 election. A scheme involving a porn star, a publisher called Pecker, and an Australian sports reporter turned gossip king. Joining us to break down the case of the people of the state of New York against Donald J. Trump is Associate Professor David Smith from the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney. David, thank you so much for joining us on Caught in the Act this week.
My pleasure.
Now, unprecedented is a word that's been used a lot to describe American politics in the last few years, but the last few days or so, truly have been. I mean, the 45th President of the United States is sitting in a court every day fighting 34 counts of falsifying business records. What have you made of it so far?
It certainly is completely unprecedented, not just that he's a former president, but that he is a current presidential candidate. And if the polls are to be believed, he's got a better than even chance of winning the presidency. So we've never seen this happening in a presidential campaign before, where one of the candidates is sitting in a courtroom listening to these criminal proceedings against him. It's certainly very dramatic. Under New York law, this case can't be televised, so that maybe reduces the drama a bit, and it means we're all relying on court reporting. From everything that we've heard, Trump is a very placid figure in the courtroom, which is not something that we're used to. He sits there pretty quietly. He looks very bored. But as soon as he gets out of the courtroom, he is his typical self. He is holding these impromptu press conferences, railing against the prosecutors. He's been ordered not to rail against the judge or the court staff, but he is denouncing all of this as this very political process. He claims that it's the Biden administration going after him. He, in many ways, is turning this into a campaign event because while he's required to be in court, he can't go and do all the campaigning that he would normally do. So I think that we should look at this as very much part of the 2024 election campaign, even if that's not what was intended by the prosecutors.
Yeah. I mean, placid is a word. I mean, there's been eyewitness accounts, we say, of Mr. Trump actually falling asleep in court. And in his own inimitable style, even this morning, he's put something out on his own Truth Social saying, "No, I'm not asleep. I'm just resting my beautiful blue eyes so I can listen intently to what's been said about me and the allegations put before me." I mean, only Donald Trump could turn a sleep in court into look how brilliant and intensely focused I am.
Yes, absolutely. And he always does this act of anything that could make him look bad is actually not just a positive, but proof of his singular genius. And this court case is not going to be any different. His social media activity, if anything, has really ramped up. He has been ordered, as I said, no longer to attack the judge or court staff or witnesses or jurors on social media, but his social media output has been absolutely prodigious during this trial.
Yeah. So, in some short form, in 2015, having nominated as a potential candidate in the 2016 US election, Trump invited his friend and National Enquirer publisher David Pecker for a meeting at Trump Towers. Also in attendance was Trump's former lawyer and fixer, Michael Cohen. At that meeting, Pecker agreed to be Trump's eyes and ears for the campaign, running negative stories about Trump's political rivals, as well as buying up negative stories specifically so they didn't hit the newsstands, the so-called catch and kill campaign. The stories that were subsequently snared and disposed of allegedly included a doorman claiming he knew about an extramarital baby that Trump had fathered, cost $30,000. Playboy model Karen McDougal, who claimed to have had an affair with Trump, cost $150,000. And Stormy Daniels, real name Stephanie Clifford, a pneumatic adult film actress who was willing to go on record and into some detail about her liaison with Trump in 2006, cost $130,000. Prosecutors allege that Cohen was tasked with paying that price to Ms. Daniels for her to keep quiet, with her tale set to drop just after the infamous tape of Mr. Trump was aired, which caught him bragging that he could sexually assault women because he was famous.
And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy.
Following Trump's shock election win, Cohen was allegedly repaid by several checks, and those were listed in Trump's business records as legal services. Prosecutors say that was a lie, that was a cover-up, and that was a conspiracy to sway the 2016 election.
First quote that we have is the prosecution laying out its theory of the case, which is, quote, "This case is about a criminal conspiracy and a cover-up. The defendant, Donald Trump, orchestrated a criminal scheme to corrupt the 2016 presidential election. Then he covered up that criminal conspiracy by lying in his New York business records over and over and over again."
Trump's attorney, Todd Blanche, of course, denied all the charges.
We are going to continue to fight. We're going to continue to do everything that we can to defend President Trump in that courtroom.
And, of course, Trump has repeatedly had his say.
I don't know how you can have a trial that's going on right in the middle of an election. Not fair. Not fair. It's not fair at all. He knows that, too. He's a Democrat judge. He wants to do that because they're all trying to damage Trump as much as possible. It's having the reverse effect, but maybe someday it won't. I don't know.
David, if this wasn't being heard in a Manhattan court, you could be forgiven for thinking it was one of those National Enquirer specials. But this isn't fake news. This is real. And this is serious, like felony serious.
Yeah. So the big task of prosecutors is going to be convincing the jury that this whole story, which is quite outlandish, quite entertaining when you're watching it from a distance, really does amount to a felony crime. Now, the fact that Trump falsified business records, I think that's going to be fairly easy to show. They seem to have quite a lot of evidence of that. But that in itself is usually a misdemeanor crime. It's not something that would send somebody to jail. What the prosecution is saying, though, is that this is a lot more serious because of the fact that it was done in the service of fraudulently interfering with the 2016 election. That the reason why these falsely classified payments were made was to affect the outcome of the 2016 election. And therefore, it's not just falsification of business records, it's falsification with intent to commit fraud. Fraud against New York election, fraud against federal election, fraud against New York state tax law. Now, actually convincing the jurors of the seriousness of this, that I would say is going to be the major task for the prosecutors. And that's not as straightforward as just showing that there was falsification of business records. And one of the things that this case could turn on is really how serious jurors think that this is. The prosecution is describing this as a conspiracy to sway the 2016 election. Trump's lawyers are saying there's no conspiracy here. This is just democracy. He was a presidential candidate. He has the right to try to influence an election. And these meetings that took place between Trump and David Pecker, that's all completely legal. That's not a conspiracy at all. So the prosecution is certainly emphasizing that this is a lot more serious than it looks. Like, yes, it just looks like a tabloid story, but actually it's about very high-level fraud. Trump's team of lawyers are going to be arguing that there was nothing fraudulent about it, that there was no improper interference in the election, that, this is something that any politician might do.
And two things strike me. First, that exposed Hollywood tape that I just mentioned, that was a bombshell when it dropped, but it didn't, and a lot of people thought, well, he's coast. He's never going to win now. He did. So what's more serious, that tape or the fact that he might have had a liaison with a porn star, 10 years prior? And two things, sorry. The second thing is the base that Donald Trump appeals to. It appears to me that if that Stormy Daniels story had come out, he might have used that to show how virile I am, how attractive I am. I mean, look at the women that I've had in my past. I mean, wouldn't you want to be a president like that or have a president like that?
Yeah, these are complicated questions. I personally think the Access Hollywood tape was a lot more serious because what it was describing was sexual assault. Yeah. But we have to remember that at the time, Trump was really going after the evangelical Christian vote in the United States. Now, in 2024, that vote is so solidly behind him that it's hard to even remember a time that it wasn't. But back in the second half of 2016, there were a lot of conservative Christians who were really not sure about Trump at all. And if this had come out that he'd been cheating on his wife with a porn star and paying her hush money, that might have been enough to turn some Christians who were already a bit worried about him off altogether. Now, as it turned out, that story never came out. There was also this very important thing that happened in 2016, which is that Justice Antonin Scalia died. And Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, refused to actually let Barack Obama's nominee even have a hearing, which meant that the presidential race was now a race over the Supreme Court, among other things. And Trump promised, I will appoint judges who will overturn Roe versus Wade. I will appoint reliably conservative judges. And I think that, in the end, is what got him over the line with those conservative Christian voters. This certainly wouldn't have helped his cause. I think it's impossible to say now what effect it actually would have had on the election. I think you're right. There certainly would have been Trump supporters who would have thought, yes, this is great. This is the kind of man that we want. But he was trying to appeal to quite a broad coalition. So I think it's impossible to say how it actually would have affected the outcome. Whether this would have changed the election outcome is not the subject of the trial. I think it's something that will get talked about a lot. It's not the responsibility of prosecutors to show that this would have actually changed the election outcome. What they're trying to show is that Trump intended to affect the election outcome by falsifying business records to cover up these payments.
So, First up, in that Manhattan court earlier this month, 4 days of jury selection. 18 jurors and a system completely at odds with that in Australia and Western Australia. Here, of course, no details whatsoever of a juror is revealed or allowed to be published. No one is allowed to approach, let alone discuss or interview a jury member. But in Manhattan, the jury is poured over one by one, with Fox News even predicting the outcome of the case based on the details that were released about the jury before a skerrick of evidence had even been heard.
Here's what we know about them. The foreman, juror number 1. He's a salesman from Harlem who was born in Ireland. He used to be a waiter, didn't finish college, and likes anything outdoorsy. He's married with no kids. His wife's in school. He gets his news from the New York Times, the Daily Mail, and some Fox News and MSNBC.
After the opening statements came the first witness, David Pecker. Pecker told the court he did buy McDougal's story to prevent it from interfering in the 2016 election, to benefit Trump's campaign. Pecker said he believed Trump wanted to kill stories for that campaign. He said he was certain he would be reimbursed by Trump. He said Trump thanked him. And he actually said he refused to pay directly for the Stormy Daniels story because involvement with a porn star would be, and get this, a moral stain on the magazine. The same magazine which published a picture of Elvis in his coffin on the cover. David Pecker is a key witness because his testimony potentially directly links Trump with the money and Pecker and the deal.
Yes. So his testimony has been used from the outset by the prosecution to say that this was a concerted effort to influence the election, that Trump met with Pecker and with Michael Cohen, and that this is what they were discussing. So they're really trying to prove that intent, that this is what it was all about. So Pecker, as a witness, he's certainly very close to Trump during this period. He has a lot more insider knowledge than just about any witness that you could produce. But I suppose for the prosecution, the problem with him as a witness is that he's a publisher of tabloid sleaze. As you said, a lot of the stories that he published were completely made up. So maybe he's not the most credible witness. And it has really been flagged by the defence that one of their main strategies is going to be to go after the credibility of those witnesses. So I suppose we'll see how credible the jury thinks that David Pecker actually is as a witness.
Yeah. And it struck me, it is somewhat ironic that a man who's basically made his name and his brand on the art of the deal is claiming complete ignorance over this deal, which other witnesses swear blind was done in his name.
Yeah, this deal certainly sounds like a deal that Trump would have made and been personally involved with. And he's got a long history of being very directly involved in his own image management. He would famously call up tabloids under the pseudonym of John Barron to plant stories in there about himself. So to me, it personally strains credibility to think that he wouldn't have had anything to do with it. His lawyers argue he was the president of a company. This is not the sort of thing that a president of a company deals with. But we have to remember Trump is no ordinary president of a company. He has a lot more direct control over that company, which he 100% owns, than than your average corporate president has.
I love that story about Trump impersonating, some minion hack that was spruiking sort of stories about him. The name John Barron, and as you know, most Trump watchers will know, that is actually the name of his youngest son as well, Barron. So it does strike me that word sort of appeals to maybe Trump's feudal side, that he sees himself as some overlord sitting over everyone rather than a democratically elected nomination, candidate.
That's right. His word choices are always so revealing.
More witnesses have followed Mr. Pecker. Trump's longtime assistant, Rona Graff, has said she had a recollection of seeing Ms. Daniels at Trump Tower sometime before the 2016 election. Trump's lawyers said that was for a potential audition for The Apprentice. Private banker Gary Farrow has described the financial shenanigans related to the alleged catch-and-kill scheme. And Keith Davidson, the attorney for both Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, has been grilled about his recollections and texts he shared with the then editor of the National Enquirer, a man called Dylan Howard. Keen Australian media watchers may remember Mr. Howard as the reporter that in 2008 was accused of playing dirty pool over a story about the medical records of AFL players. He broadcast confidential details of two unnamed players' drug use and subsequent counselling. Mr. Howard was cleared of theft, but dumped by his employer. So he eventually moved to America and rapidly moved up the celebrity publication food chain. By 2016, he was the editor in charge of the National Enquirer, and as such, has found himself at the heart of this alleged conspiracy. David, in terms of this story, this case, and Mr. Trump, what's Dylan Howard alleged to have done?
Well, according to David Pecker's testimony in court, Howard was the negotiator of a lot of these deals. So it was Howard who negotiated the deal with Karen McDougal. He, among other things, he had to assess whether these stories were true or not. And so he believed that Karen McDougal's story was true, and Pecker, as a result, paid $150,000 for that story to be killed. Now, he was also talking to Stormy Daniels, but this time Pecker didn't want to pay himself for this because, she wanted $120,000. She said that she already had offers from the Mail and Good Morning America. And Pecker said in court that I said we'd already paid $30,000 to the doorman. We'd already paid $150,000 to Karen McDougal. I am not a bank. And that's the point where Pecker advised that Cohen should actually pay Daniels for the story in order to take it off the market. So whereas the rest of these catch and kill episodes, it was the National Enquirer who was doing the payment in return for inside stories and publicity from Trump. This time, through the intermediary of Dylan Howard, it was actually Trump himself who was paying the hush money.
And you mentioned credibility of witnesses earlier. Howard's credibility, I understand or believe or would assume, is going to come under attack as well, because he was mentioned in a book by Ronan Farrow, who was a book entitled Catch and Kill. And Trump wasn't the only man that Mr. Howard was allegedly helping in this way. There was another person that employed such tactics. I think you might know his name, David, Harvey Weinstein.
Yes, absolutely. That is one of the people that is absolutely linked to this, and I'm sure that Trump's lawyers are going to bring that up as much as possible in order to discredit Dylan Howard. Howard is also, I think, not going to be in the courtroom. He is in Australia and he has a medical condition, which means he's unable to go back to the United States. Just one interesting little detail that the prosecutors has brought up is Howard apparently said in a text message, at least if he wins, referring to Trump, I'll be pardoned for electoral fraud. Now, that's a big text for the prosecutors, because they're saying this is evidence that everybody who was involved knew that this amounted to electoral fraud.
Just a bit of ironic Aussie humour, I would imagine, David, would be the way the other side might present that.
Well, if they're capable of understanding that,
yes.
Ironic Aussie humour.
Yes, irony is a foreign concept across the pond. So, the trial is slated to continue inside for weeks. But just as scandalous as what's been happening inside is what Trump has been saying outside every day. For days, Trump has exited court left and then got right into it, slamming the judge, the court, the prosecutors, the witnesses, the jury, even the air conditioning inside the courtroom. Eventually, Judge Juan Merchan reprimanded the former president and 2024 presidential candidate, but that failed to stop him. So this week, Donald Trump was fined $9,000 for repeated breaches of Judge Merchan's gag order. And there have been hints that if he was to continue, then those fines would increase and potentially could lead to incarceration.
He says, in part, that this was a willful violation by Donald Trump. Along with those $1,000 fines, Donald Trump has been ordered to remove each of those 9 posts on his social media account by the end of the day.
David, again, an extraordinary state of affairs, which I have to say we probably, well, almost certainly wouldn't see in Australia. What is Trump trying to do here? Influence jurors? What is he playing to his base? Getting himself locked up to play the martyr? I mean, can he just not help himself or stop himself?
I think he is really playing to his base here, remembering that this is effectively part of the 2024 election campaign. And yes, he loves to play the martyr, but he's actually doing it in the knowledge that he's not going to get locked up. So he can basically challenge the judge to lock him up. But the logistical, legal and political problems involved in locking him up means it's probably never going to happen because Trump, under US law, as a former president, has to have a pretty large Secret Service detail with him all the time. And that means that putting him in a jail as opposed to a prison, so jail is where you go for contempt of court, would be logistically impossible. There's even been speculation that if he was ever convicted of anything really serious, even prison would probably be impossible. And in other countries where former heads of state have gone to prison, it's usually been some form of home arrest. So he can probably tell his base that he is effectively risking getting locked up for his freedom of speech, securing the knowledge that it is not actually going to happen. And these fines that are being levied on Trump, they're not going to mean very much either. As it happens, a lot of his political fundraising at the moment is effectively paying his legal fees. Part of this is also that Trump just loves to push boundaries as far as he possibly can to show that nobody can ever control him. And even though he has been a little bit more restrained since these gag orders came into place, I think that this is partly about showing that just nothing at all can restrain him, which is something that his base absolutely loves.
Yeah. It conjures a wonderful mental image of Trump in one of those sort of run-down lockups with, 3 men in black either side of him with shades and earpieces in saying, he's locked down, he's not going anywhere. But more seriously, I mean, it is... Trump has always challenged everything, including the rule of law and the justice system in itself. He constantly monologues about how this is, electoral fraud in itself, and Biden's trying to prevent me from running, and it's a challenge to the ordered system of things, isn't it?
It really is. Because one of the principles of the rule of law is that nobody is above the law, no matter how powerful they are or have been. And the fact that it is pretty much logistically and politically impossible to subject Trump to the same kind of punishment as you would subject anybody else who is in contempt of court, that is a real problem. And remember, bearing in mind, even other very rich and powerful people have gone to jail for doing the kinds of things that Trump is doing at the moment. Sam Bankman-Fried, the crypto billionaire, or fair to say, former crypto billionaire now, he went to jail for saying something that was construed as intimidating a witness. So this is really demonstrating that Trump is, in some sense, above the law, which is a big problem for the rule of law. But the other thing that we always have to keep in mind is that this is always going to be about more than the rule of law. This is going to be about politics. And this is someone who is seen as the political leader of half of the country. If we look to the experiences of other countries which have experienced tremendous political conflict and where crimes have been committed in the name of politics or under cover of politics, we sometimes see that in those societies they opt not to prosecute in order to maintain some kind of social peace or political peace. And certainly there would be some who argue that prosecuting Trump is a very dangerous thing, even if there is a good legal case for it, because of the fact that it just further inflames political divisions, and it raises the stakes of political divisions as well. It means that this election could well be about the issue of whether Trump is going to go to jail or not, whether Trump is going to face some kind of criminal punishment or not, which makes it an incredibly high stakes election for him, and also for a lot of his supporters. So I mean, we're probably going to require years of historical hindsight to know whether or not this prosecution was a wise thing, to know whether or not it would have been better to try to uphold the rule of law, or whether it would have been better to seek political peace.
The scary extrapolation that I've noted Trump talking about is his suggestion of presidential immunity. Now, if he was to run on that and get an elected mandate on that, I mean, talk about the changing face of politics in America. I mean, it wouldn't be a democracy anymore, would it? If a president is granted immunity, so he can just do what he wants.
Yeah, and this is being argued in the Supreme Court at the moment. Trump's lawyers are arguing for absolute presidential immunity, that a president can't be prosecuted for a crime at all, no matter what they do. It's unlikely that the Supreme Court is going to accept that wholesale. But some justices in the Supreme Court, judged by what they have said in response to this, some of them do seem to accept an argument that if a president is doing something as part of their constitutional duty, then they should be immune from prosecution. And some judges have seemed to be sympathetic to the arguments made by Trump's lawyers that unless you have presidential immunity, then no president will be safe from some, vengeful political prosecution afterwards. They won't be able to do anything as president. I would say in response to that, though, we've only ever had this problem with Trump. This is the first time that this has actually come up. And another argument that some Supreme Court justices are making, which is pretty interesting in this context, is that, well, if you give a president immunity, then they're much more likely to just peacefully step aside when they lose. Now, once again, this is a problem that's only ever come up with Trump. So this does look a lot like justices really considering new interpretations of the law that are just based around the experience of Trump. And it certainly, I don't know if it would mean that, I don't think it would mean the US would cease to be a democracy, but it would expand the reach of presidential power in really unprecedented ways.
And so, as they say in the classic, the trial continues. And how? Still to come is superstar witness Michael Cohen, the fixer who found himself in prison after working in the shadows for Trump for years. And of course, Stormy Daniels' testimony. One can only imagine what she will be asked and how she will answer. David, In 2022, you helped publish a chapter in a book about the changing face of investigative journalism. It was called From Watergate to Trump World, The Declining Power of Scandals. The main thrust of that chapter, as I understand it, is sort of Richard Nixon, through Watergate, was forced to resign and political renewal ensued. Trump has survived his various scandal and, pretty much chaos has ensued. And you just mentioned it then that the political division that has come from Trump in his embodiment and then Trump and his prosecutions, it seems to have just hardened both sides, crystallized both sides in what could become, quite a concerning way.
It really has. In the end, there were Republicans who were prepared to turn against Richard Nixon, although he was quite popular with the Republican base right up until the end. The other difference is Richard Nixon ultimately was prepared to fall on his own sword. And if we think about the nature of political scandal very carefully, just about everybody who loses their job or is forced to resign or their political career ends as a result of a scandal, nearly all of them fall on their own sword. Nearly all of them realise they're in an untenable, humiliating situation and that there's no way they can go on. This will never happen with Trump. He will never concede any kind of wrongdoing for anything. He will never back down, never apologise, which is one of the things that his supporters absolutely love about him and see as a major strength, even when it's in the context of a criminal trial. I saw a very interesting legal observation about this trial, which is that Trump's lawyers are not using the same kinds of tactics that criminal defence lawyers usually use. It's kind of a cliche that's familiar to all of us from television, that lawyers will often say things like, the issue is not whether my client is a good guy, the issue is whether he is guilty. Or they will, they'll concede to some kind of wrongdoing by their client, but they will make the point that it doesn't, it's not the specific criminal offence that they're on trial for. Now, those kinds of tactics are off limits to Trump's lawyers. Trump essentially insists that his lawyers act like campaign spokespeople and that his lawyers always claim that Trump has never done anything wrong. And that's exactly what they are saying in this case as well. Not that the prosecution has failed to reach the very high bar required for showing that this is a felony offence. Instead, they're saying, no, Trump has done nothing wrong at all, which is kind of a risky strategy. I think that the case that the prosecution is making is very complicated, and this trial's going on for a few weeks, so the jury is going to see it all. But they'll make it as strongly as they can. But nonetheless, it's pretty complicated. It's quite complicated to explain, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if there was at least one juror who decided the prosecution is drawing too long a bow here. They're drawing too many connections that aren't here. However, while this is going on, Trump is behaving pretty badly outside the court. He is constantly being reprimanded by the judge for his behaviour. The judge is telling his lawyer that his lawyer is losing credibility because of the very shaky arguments that he's making against the gag order. Some part of me thinks that Trump's biggest danger is the danger that he poses to himself. During the defamation trial of
Jean Carroll,
Jean Carroll, this was the same problem. Defamation is a hard thing to prove in the United States. And, some observers say it may have been Trump's own behaviour that actually did him in this trial. So the fact that his whole political persona is that he never concedes anything. He won't concede an election loss. He won't concede any wrongdoing. There is no possibility he's ever going to back down or fall on his sword. That could actually negatively affect the ability of his own lawyers to conduct an effective defence here.
Yeah. Lawyers get paid very well, but you could not pay me enough money in the world to represent DJ Trump. And if he's acquitted, obviously that will play to his strengths. He'll say, I beat the man, it was all a conspiracy, you know, they never should have brought it, and look how great I am. If he's convicted, though, it strikes me that could firm up his political base even further, because then he can say, well, look, you know, they've come after me, I told you this was going to happen, and, you know, infamy, they've all got it in for me.
Yeah, everything that he does seems to firm up his position with his base, and this undoubtedly would. The big question is, how would the few people who are undecided,
the middle voters, the swaying voters,
at this point respond? And bearing in mind, we're looking at an election with two historically unpopular candidates. This election is probably going to be decided by people who dislike both Trump and Biden, but dislike one of them enough that they will come out to vote against them. There is some survey data that indicates that if Trump were actually convicted of a crime, that a majority of Americans would see that as disqualifying him for higher office. And I think that he and his campaign and his legal team would be worried that this could just be a bridge too far for a lot of people. That this is not an allegation, this is an actual conviction. However, in the past, we've seen survey data that, suggested that things that Trump had done had been disqualifying. We saw that immediately after the Access Hollywood tapes came out. We have to remember that there was a period of a couple of weeks when there were all kinds of Republicans saying, this was too much, I can't support Trump anymore. They were hoping, they were maybe even expecting that after this, he would step down from the nomination, but he didn't. And that's what set the pattern for everything. And then Republicans swung into line behind him. There were a lot of Republicans who said that if Trump wouldn't accept the results of the 2020 election, then they could no longer support him. And in the immediate aftermath of January 6th, there seemed to be a lot of Republicans who had completely sworn off Trump. But within a few years, they'd all come back in line behind him. So whatever people say in surveys about being convicted of a crime would be a disqualifying thing, it's not necessarily how they're going to act when that thing actually happens. And this is known to survey researchers as social desirability bias, which is people give answers that they believe are the socially acceptable answers. So, of course, someone who's convicted of a crime shouldn't be president. We also have to remember that a lot of people who would have told survey researchers if someone's convicted of a crime, they shouldn't be president, would be people who are fully expecting that Trump will never be convicted of a crime and that Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton might be convicted of a crime at some point in the future. So it's very, very hard to tell how this is going to play out if he actually gets convicted. And as I say, I think it's completely up in the air whether he'll get convicted or not. I could see it going either way.
And, of course, this isn't the only indictment Trump faces, but it is highly likely to be the only one he faces before the November election. Briefly talk us through the other allegations that he's facing.
Sure. So the most serious one is the case that is being mounted by federal prosecutor Jack Smith about Trump's involvement in January 6th. And this is really saying that Trump was involved in a conspiracy to overturn the election. It's by far the most serious one. Now, that now looks very unlikely to happen before the November election because Trump's lawyers have made this argument about immunity, which the Supreme Court agreed to hear, which that delayed it for a few more months. From what we're seeing, the Supreme Court looks most likely to, first of all, send that back down to the lower court that it came from, and they'll have to deliberate again. So it's most observers are now saying that looks unlikely to happen before the November election. And that one, because it's a federal case, that would mean that if Trump actually won the election, he would just be able to order the Department of Justice to drop that altogether. So this is another thing that really raises the stakes of that election. Another one that he could conceivably face this year, but also looks unlikely, is the Florida documents case. So this is the fact that he took classified documents to Mar-a-Lago and was storing them in a not very secure environment there. So this has been presided over by Justice Eileen Cannon, who was one of Trump's appointees. And she has she's been subjected by Trump's lawyers to all of these tactics to try to delay the election, a lot of claims and counterclaims about evidence. And so far, I wouldn't say she's necessarily dragging her feet, but this is dragging a lot. And it does look like this one probably is also not going to happen before the November election. The one that would possibly be the most consequential if Trump were convicted is the Georgia racketeering case, which is alleging this conspiracy with 18 co-conspirators to overturn the election in Georgia, that's being prosecuted under laws that are usually used for criminal gang leaders. And that would be a very serious one because of the penalties involved, because of the fact that it is a state level offence that we're talking about. So it's not something that could be cancelled by Trump or overturned in any way, even if he becomes president. But that one could actually be years away from happening because it is so big and it is so complicated. It's been further complicated by the fact that the lawyer of another defendant alleged that the prosecutor who's involved, Fani Willis, was in an improper relationship with another prosecutor that tainted the case. And even though she seems to have survived that, it's added layers of complication and delay. So it does look like this is going to be the only trial that Trump actually faces before November. There is a possibility that the Florida documents case could happen, but we don't really know when or under what circumstances. So for the time being, this is the trial.
And, I mean, very finally, it seems incredible to me that you can just lay out those three other cases he's facing, other than the one involving a porn star on the National Enquirer, and he can still be the overwhelmingly sort of dominant candidate on one side of American politics and very possibly the leader of the free world come the end of this year.
Yes, absolutely. And, I mean, there was a time immediately after the 2022 election where it looked like Trump might have been fatally wounded. A lot of Republicans were blaming the results of the 2022 election on him and these unelectable candidates that he backed, and the fact that he was always saying that the election was stolen. It looked like there were some other strong Republican candidates in the field. But then this remarkable thing happened, which was that Republicans began to fall into line behind him again. And this case was the first of these criminal cases that was announced. And if anything, this one really had a galvanizing effect. You could see it in the opinion polls, the way that Republicans really started to get behind Trump again after this case was announced. So this case, yes, it could be the one that gets him convicted. It could also go down in history as the one that got him elected.
Associate Professor David Smith, fascinating conversation this morning. Thanks so much for joining us on Caught in the Act again this week.
My pleasure.
And thanks to all the listeners for joining us again. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with us by writing to caughtintheact@wanews.com.au. And don't forget to like and subscribe and tell anyone you know how good we are. And remember, if you want to know what's going on in court, don't get caught short. Get caught in the act instead. See you next week.